I want to welcome you to our 5th class on shame. Tonight we're moving into the New Testament, and we're going to look and see what Jesus has to teach about shame. We're going to look and see what Jesus does with shame, because you'll see, I think shame plays an important part and role in the ministry of Jesus. I want to begin with a reading out of Mark 5, beginning in verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and she spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather she grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd. She touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." There is in the Old Testament this idea and notion of sin as a contaminant. That when one is in the proximity of or makes contact with something that is unclean, there will be transference. The uncleanliness of that thing or person will then transfer to another thing or person. So in the Old Testament, we have what might be called a negative dominant factor. The unclean person who encounters the clean person will make the clean person now unclean. So just one of many texts we could look at, Leviticus 11, verses 39 through 40. If an animal of which you eat dies, anyone who touches its carcass shall be unclean until the evening. Those who eat of the carcass shall wash their clothes and be unclean until the evening. And those who carry the carcass shall wash their clothes and be unclean until evening. So in the Old Testament model, the clean person will make contact with something that is unclean, and the result is that now that person becomes unclean. So being unclean is the more powerful or dominant force. So purity is found through the avoidance of the contaminants. So if you're struggling to figure out all this Old Testament stuff, just think about the model that we have in dealing with the coronavirus. If you do not want the coronavirus, you need to avoid contact or proximity to it. That's going to be best done by social distancing, by keeping away, by staying apart. Because if you're exposed to somebody who has the coronavirus, they're going to give you the virus. You're not going to give them a cleansing or a removal from the virus. There is also in the Old Testament a positive dominant pattern, which is that anything that is related to or identified with God, when things come in proximity to that, they can then be made clean. There's an example in Exodus 29, verse 37. 7 days you shall make atonement for the altar and consecrate it, and the altar shall be most holy. Whoever touches the altar shall become holy. So here what we see is this pattern can reverse, where God can make somebody who comes in contact with him or something he designates as holy, it is possible for that thing to make the person holy. So we do see this place or this possibility where holiness can be contagious. And holiness can be more powerful than a contamination. But for a thing to have that possibility and opportunity, God himself must be involved in the holiness process. And we're going to find in the New Testament that Jesus is then an example of positive dominant person when it comes to cleanliness. See, Christ's purity is such that when one comes in contact with him, it doesn't make Christ unclean, but instead the transference moves the other way. The other person or the other thing is now made clean. And somehow, and I have no idea, but the woman here in our text makes that connection about Jesus. She realizes that he is positive dominant, that if she makes contact with him, that cleanliness will then transfer over to her. Mark 5:29, immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" Do you see the transference model at work here? Jesus takes upon himself something, whether that be her uncleanliness or whether that be her disease, perhaps even her sin and her shame. But in exchange, Jesus gives her his holiness, his cleansing, and his healing. And Jesus even notices that power goes out from him, so something of Jesus is given to her. But the process isn't complete yet. See, we know from 5:28 that she wanted to be made well, but so far she has been healed. But this word of healed doesn't have this broader sense of being made well. In other words, she's not fully restored. If you think about it like the coronavirus, the goal of the vaccine that's supposed to be coming isn't just so that you won't be able to get sick. The vaccine is to enable us to go back into intimate, fully functioning communities. I think that we would all agree that if they come out with a vaccine that makes it possible that we can't get sick, that's good, but it's not best. What's best is a vaccine that makes it so that we cannot get sick, so we can go back into, for example, as a church, meeting together, talking together, visiting more closely. The healing is really incomplete until the entire community is able to be brought back together. So it's the disciples in verse 31 who say, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling. She fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And the key for us is going to be to ask the question about why Jesus forces this public discourse. Jesus brings her into a public place. In our text last week in the Old Testament, we realize that there's an important part of shame that has to be dealt with in the public sphere or in the public space. And I think one of the things that we can start to realize is that shame is so public that whatever is dealt with in shame must also be public. So she no longer has the flow of blood, but she's not yet been designated as being well or whole, or a word that can even mean salvation. And so she came with fear and trembling. And there's all sorts of little cues in this text about why she would come with fear and trembling. And I think that that's best seen as you compare her to the synagogue leader Jairus, who's also mentioned in this text. So let's just take a minute and compare these two people as we get a picture of why she might be ashamed and how that shame might be functioning in our text. On the first side, we have a man who comes on behalf of his daughter. And on the other side, we have a woman who herself comes, who has been bleeding for 12 years. He is named Jairus. She remains unnamed. He is a man. She is a woman. He is in many ways the ultimate or penultimate insider. He is a leader of the synagogue. If you were to read the who's who of Jewish people, he would be in that magazine. But yet you have this woman who is the ultimate or the quintessential outsider. She's the kind of person who is constantly left out. And I think because of their standings, they actually approach Jesus in two very different ways. The man, the known synagogue leader, Jairus, he comes up, fell at his feet, and begged him. So he has a very direct approach. But what does the woman do? She comes up behind him. Her approach is much less direct, almost as if she assumes if she directly approached Jesus, he wouldn't respond well to her. The little daughter who is sick has somebody who comes on her behalf that cares for her and wants her to be made well. But for the woman, she makes the request herself, almost as if there's nobody to make the appeal or the request on her behalf. What the synagogue leader wants is for Jesus to lay his hands on this young girl of his to heal her. And yet this woman will not ask Jesus to lay hands on her, perhaps again with the assumption that he's not going to honor that request. And so instead of asking him to lay hands, she reaches out and touches him. And she touches him because she wants to be made well. So both women in this story, one the man on behalf of his daughter and this woman, that's the ultimate. They want to be made well, to be whole, to be saved. After Jesus brings her into this public discourse, and she comes with fear and trembling because she has all sorts of reasons to assume Jesus is going to reject her, Jesus says these words in verse 34, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And I want us to notice a couple of things about some of the words here. Jesus says that your faith has made you well. That's the very thing that Jairus was requesting on behalf of his daughter. He wanted his daughter to be made well. And now this woman receives what Jairus was asking for on behalf of his daughter. See, look at these two girls. The one who has someone who cares for her, who travels this distance, who pleads on her behalf, who goes out of his way because he wants her to be made well. And then we have this, what we might just simply call a random woman. But Jesus doesn't call her a random woman. He calls her daughter. The very same term that the synagogue leader uses to reference his daughter is the word Jesus now uses to reference this woman. As if to say, that woman has a father who is appealing on her behalf, and now this woman with the flow of blood, she does also. That just as that father functions, wanting what's right for his daughter, Jesus is doing that for this woman. She is his daughter. This is ascribed honor. She's not honored because of who she is or what she's done, but she's honored because she has been called a daughter of Jesus. And then he tells her to go in peace. Now, I think we typically view this as kind of psychological, like, the head games are going to be gone and I'm going to be at peace. But peace is a word that talks about community wholeness, community peace, community restoration. And so Jesus brings her into the public square, shows her and everyone that she is well, so that then the community is going to accept her back in. So the main reason Jesus brings her out is not to further her shame, but to testify and witness to the community that this is my daughter. And as such, she needs to be welcomed back fully into her life as a full participant of the community. And so shame can function in a very similar way, where it is removed from us, and that the community once again can accept us, and we can be fully restored. We can be made well, completely well. See, I think in this short text, there's several points of application for us as we deal with shame today. Shame typically will demand that we stand before one of or all three judges or standards. The first is ourself. We can be healed, but not always view ourselves as having been made well. We stand before others who might say, well, you're better, but you're not well. And then we stand before God who heals us and God who also cares for us. But the problem is I look at standing before my assessment of self, my assessment in the eyes of others, and my assessment in the eyes of God, is that it's so hard for me to view those other perspectives apart from my own. In other words, I can know how I feel about myself, and because of how I feel about myself, I can transfer to you how you're looking at me, what you're thinking about me, what you're saying about me. And so even if you're looking at me with love and care and acceptance, if I'm still viewing myself with shame, I'm going to assume you're looking at me as a person who still carries or bears shame. If that removal of shame hasn't affected me on a personal level, then as I look at what God says about me, how God views me, I'm going to dismiss that also. I'm going to say that I'm not worthy of that cleansing. I'm not worthy of that acceptance. I'm not worthy to be made well. And I may begin to doubt that God's words are actually words that can remove my shame. So for there to be restoration, I have to be fully mended. In my conversation with myself, I have to believe what Christ says about me. And in my relationship to others, I have to believe that they welcome me just like Christ welcomes me. And as I stand before God, I have to believe that in Christ, I have become the righteousness of God. God made him who knew no sin to be sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So I have to believe the truth that God reveals rather than the lies that shame tries to convince me of. And this is why it's so important that we differentiate between the legal stance of guilt and the slower restoration of honor. Edward Welch says it this way: here's your task. You are learning how to live in a new kingdom, even while you have vivid memories of the old one. So God says and declares things about our guilt and about our shame, but sometimes it takes a little bit of time for us to fully believe, to live into that reality. Here's one way I think about it. I've mentioned to many of you that I get motion sick pretty easily, and so we took a 2 or 3 day cruise once just to see how I would do on it. And I remember we took a day or two and we got to the Bahamas, and we were walking around in the Bahamas, and I was off the boat, and I knew that I was not on the boat, but my body still felt like it was on the boat. As I walked around, it was like the ground was moving under me. It took me a few days until I felt like I was back on solid ground again. And shame is very similar in that God declares us innocent, that others can even welcome us, but we may still feel like we're under the influence of shame. And so what God is wanting us to do is to begin to embrace and to accept and to live into the reality so that his affirmation of us can take effect in the deepest parts of our soul. I came across this illustration that I think can highlight the way we have to view this topic and really wrestle with the ongoing impact of shame. There's a guy named Joseph K. who is the main character in a book called The Trial by Franz Kafka. And Joseph is going about his life as normal, and one day out of the blue, the police rush in, they take him into custody, they handcuff him, but nobody ever tells him what he did wrong. He doesn't have a trial. He's moved from prison to prison. All the while he's saying, what have I been accused of? What have I done? And no one answers that question. How do you feel if you're Joseph? Unjustly persecuted? Unfairly mistreated? You would proclaim your innocence. But what if in a conversation somebody whispered to you, your crime was not legal, it was moral? What's that bad thing you've done? And at that moment, I suspect our tone and tune will shift a little bit. I can't say anymore, this is so unjust. There's no immorality with me. I've never sinned. I've never done wrong. In fact, the question might become, which sin got found out? Which wrongdoing has been discovered? And I think many of us live, even in our Christian lives, with this sense, this kind of foreboding, almost haunting sense, that our sin hasn't really been dealt with. That if we really let God see who we are, and we really let others see who we are, that we're going to be rejected. We're going to be accused. We're going to be tried. To understand what Jesus does in the transference of our uncleanliness to his cleanliness means trusting in the fact that every sin and every lingering shame needs to be removed so that we can live life in union with God and with Christ. I think there's two choices for us as Christians. Number one is we can hide in our shame. That's what Adam and Eve did. That's the movement that we find in the Old Testament. The other is that we can realize that our shame has been hidden in Christ. That we're confident in Christ. And we're confident in the work that he's done. We're going to talk about this a little bit more next week as we look at the cross and what the cross does with our shame. If you want to continue learning about this topic, if you want to continue a little bit of a discussion, as soon as this video ends, in a few minutes, we're going to start on our Facebook Live page. We're going to start a Facebook Live discussion. Love to have you. Love to hear your insights and your thoughts as we think about how Jesus takes our shame and makes us so that we can be shameless.